Are you stuck in the same old routine at work? Do you find yourself hitting a creative wall, unable to see beyond your current perspective? It's time to break free and unlock the power of fresh perspectives. Well, David Gouthro back here yet again with Discover a Fresh Perspective. Discovering fresh perspectives is what I love to do. And today I have the pleasure of having a conversation with my friend Michel Neray, where we really first got to know each other when we were speaking at a conference in London, England, many years ago. So, Michel, welcome.
Well, thank you. You know, you didn't prepare me for that memory. Wow. I had forgotten that's how we met. So yeah, thank you for asking me on this show. I appreciate it. I'm looking forward to having this conversation.
Now, Michel, you're a man of many talents. I know you as a consultant and various other things, but and you know, singer, songwriter. You've got one album out, another one coming out, all kinds of great stuff. You had suggested that we might have a good conversation about storytelling. So why don't we start there with what is it about storytelling that you're passionate about?
Yeah, I am passionate about storytelling. I think storytelling is the root of all good in this world. All progress, all positive progress happens with storytelling. Now, the opposite is also true. People have used storytelling to wreak terrible havoc and you know, misleading narratives and and we're seeing that in the world today, unfortunately. But that only goes to show how powerful storytelling is.
So let me dive into this just a little bit with the first part you talked about the positive change it brings about. So do you have any examples that come to mind, Michel?
Well, probably the best way that I could explain why I feel that way is really to take everyone back to when I started out in my professional career. So we're going back like a long time ago. And I was in advertising. I was a copywriter, advertising copywriter, because I have an MBA, so I have the business side, and I was a copywriter, so I had the creative side, which basically is the story of my life. This struggle between the creative and the rational. And anyway, you know, I became a I worked on the big ad campaigns and all of that stuff, and I always thought that, you know, first as a account executive and then as a copywriter. And then because I had this two dichotomies, or this dichotomy in my head about creative and strategic, you know, my clients kept on asking me to do more and more work for them and then I had to hire staff, and then I had a whole company, and then I realized I wasn't doing what I loved anymore because I was just managing the company. So I went back to being a lone consultant. There's a little bit more to that story. I built a .com. I built it up. I sold it. So I had a little bit of flexibility in there. In fact, it's around that time that you and I met, because I sat down with a good friend of mine and I said, Stuart, I know I do something pretty cool because that's what my clients tell me. But truthfully, I don't know what it is. I know I do something, and I know pretty much everybody who is listening to this podcast can relate to that. We all do incredible things, but there are very, very few of us who take the time to pinpoint what that is. We have a general idea of what that might be. We know what some of our strengths are, but very few, I shouldn't say none. I'm one. I got to figure out what this is. Because if I could figure out what it is, then I knew what I would want to do for the rest of my life, basically. And he sat down with me and he asked me all the stupid questions. It really like, oh, and then what do you do? And then why do you do that? You know, like nothing out of the order. Like just, he was driven by his own curiosity to get to the root of what I do. And he looked at me and at one point he said, Michel, it's kind of like you help your clients get to their essential message. And I said, oh my God. So that became my brand. And it's true. I had developed a knack for helping my clients dig down to their core differentiation, their true differentiation, not, the pithy, superficial stuff like sales, service, selection, but really deep down what sets you apart from everybody else. And now I feel like I was 20 years ahead of my time, because now we do talk about core messaging as a thing, but back then nobody knew what that was. It didn't understand. They said, well, why is that any different from copywriting? Well, good copywriting could put a good spin on what you think you know is true, but someone who is skilled at core messaging knows how to dig deeper to the actual core of what you do, which is where your differentiation is. So that's what I did for a number of years. And what I realized was every time, and I've worked with solopreneurs, I've worked with speakers, I've worked with large corporations, I've worked with a lot of startups who have to really communicate their raison d'être, their like, why invest in us, why take a chance on us, and what do we have that's different from anybody else, and why is it worthwhile? So I've worked with all kinds and sizes of companies and people, and I realized this. We're going back in the early 2000s. Realized very early on that when I dug deep enough to their core of their differentiation, there was always a story behind it. Always a story behind. Let me back. I kind of developed this methodology of the 5 layers of differentiation. Your top level is what you do, and that's how most of us. I'm a coach. I'm a financial advisor. I'm a solution provider. Our company builds whatever, computers, drilling machines. Doesn't matter what it is. Then it's the who, where, and when layer. If you dig a little deeper than that, who we do it for, what stage is our clients at in their development, and where, if there's geography that's required for this, and of course that's almost gone away,
right.
But not entirely. Like, if you're not that I'm trying to attract lawyers or accountants, but or real estate agents, but there are lots of professions where people deal where geography is very important, or distributors, and it doesn't matter. Like I say, I work with all different sizes of companies. So that's your top 3 layers. Now, any copywriter or marketing consultant worth his or her salt should be able to dig down to those. And that's typically how we define our positioning. We do X for...
And those sound like things that are just factual.
Yeah. Well, listen, if you're the only lawyer in a small town, you don't need to dig any deeper than that. Hey, I'm the lawyer. I'm the only lawyer in town. Differentiation enough. Ding, ding, ding. Don't need more. But in the same way that, in the beginning, there was one kind of shoe. And you know what it was called?
No.
It was called the shoe.
The shoe, right. And there was no left and right way back when.
No, I think they didn't know. They weren't that advanced. But over time, what happened to the shoe market? There's oh my God, like, they're running. Not only are there running shoes, but there are running shoes for trail running. There are running shoes for basketball. There are running shoes. Well, they're not running shoes. They're basketball shoes. You get what I'm saying? Over the course of every single market in the world, no matter what it is, there is a continual progress of slicing and dicing the market into finer and finer segments to solve a different problem. I'm getting ahead of myself. Anyway, I discovered, so the 3 layers of differentiation at the top: what I do, who, where, and when. And then some people might dig to why I do it. And I know why has become a buzzword and it's important, but that ain't it for most of us. In fact, never. That's, any copywriter or marketing consultant should be able to dig to that level. But what I've discovered, and this is magic, okay, for the people listening, this is magic. How I do what I do is where your differentiation lives. Because how you do what you do is informed by how you see the world, by how you've been brought up, the lens you see the world, your DNA, your natural curiosity about this versus that. So go back to when Stuart was asking me, and Stuart, he's another one of our colleagues, a brilliant man, and he was just being driven by his curiosity, and he wanted to know how I do what I do. And so how we do anything is where our differentiation lies. And it takes a special person to be able to dig to that level. And it's very hard to do it yourself. But there's an even deeper level. And the deeper level is why I do, how I do what I do. Make sense?
Yep.
Why do I do it this way?
Right. Okay.
And there is always a story about that.
Huh.
Because it's something that's so deeply part of who we are as people, as human beings. And it's very often because of a big mistake or negative experience that we've had in our life. And it could be a childhood thing. It could be something that we've noticed that our parents struggle with forever. And we've brought that into our very being. So it's often a very, very personal thing. It doesn't have to be. It could be the biggest mistake in my professional career when I was just starting out was this, and that's why I made it a thing to whatever. Or when I first started out in my industry, I realized that all my company and my competitors, they were doing this, which was moronic because it really didn't help our customers. And it went against my grain to keep doing that. So I developed this.
So, Michel, do you have an example that people could hang on to, something down at that level, like a story that goes down to that bottom level, that's not revealing any secrets?
Well, that's the hard part. I could tell you I was recently working with a software company, as I do a lot of tech startups. And it turned out, I mean, there were a lot of differentiators. I helped position them. They ended up getting acquired by one of the major brands, and everybody was very happy with me. You will find their testimonial on my website. But one of their points of differentiation was user interface. But, you can't just say that, even if it's true. I mean, you can, but it doesn't hold a lot. It's like, how believable is it? But once I learned that they had been working on software and technology solutions, even back when they were in the military, and they were building things for soldiers on the front line. And that's when they I'm cutting the story a bit short, but that's when they realized not only does it have to work flawlessly, but it's got to be able to be implemented even under the stress of enemy fire. And that lens, that mantra says, it was in cyber, they were working in cybersecurity. So, when you're notice that there's a breach, you don't have time to, well, let's just implement this or implement that. No, you got to find the breach. You got to figure it out. You got to stop. Lots of things. So there were lots of things that we could trace in the software that they did that I was able to trace to their mantra, which they'd never really spoken about. Because, and here's the other interesting thing. It was so obvious to them because it had become so much a part of who they were and how they built their company and their culture and their vision for the software that they were not even aware of how they were embedding every aspect of their solution with this mantra.
Right. I got that. Yeah. They were too close to it.
They're too, and that is something else that I found. Even I was working with a company, what were they doing? This was a while ago, so you're stretching my brain here a little bit. I was working with a company, and they did like heavy duty hydraulic pumps, like huge industrial. And just in conversation with them, I was like, they were, they had the usual differentiators. But when I really drilled down with them, I found out that their founder, 100 years ago, who was long since passed, one of the little stories that is on, page 18 at the bottom of their website or whatever it is, because it's just the way they do things. He was faced with a problem in working with a hydraulic pump. And that's why he decided to over-engineer this one particular part of the pump and blah, blah, blah. And that made sense. All of a sudden, that made sense to me. So that's why I say how we do is where differentiation lies, but why we do how we do is the story behind it. So we're still in the early 2000s. I became really highly aware of the power of story, because as a copywriter, I know that it's one thing to claim something, which nobody believes because everybody else claims it.
Yep.
But it's quite another thing to communicate it impactfully in a way that they come to the conclusion of what you're claiming without you having to tell them.
Well, and Michel, it seems to me that part of a good story is that it almost begs to be retold. That I don't know if too many people, when they see a company that's describing their product and a whole list of facts, that they go and tell someone else exactly the same list of facts, right? It just doesn't stick.
People don't, well, yeah, there's tons of research that talks about facts versus story. People remember stories, they won't necessarily remember the facts. But there's another aspect, and it has to do with this claim versus allowing the listener, the audience, to come to their own conclusion. And this is actually a literary technique, in how we build characters in books, but also, like, if I tell you my neighbor is a terrible person, oh, you'll never want to meet him, he's terrible, we're constantly arguing about stuff, and I hate him, and he's just horrible. Like, trust me, David, he's horrible. And the more I go on, probably the more you have in the back of your mind says, well, what's wrong with you that makes him do that? See what I'm saying?
Yep.
So I'm making a bold claim, but whatever. But now, if I don't forget that I've said that, and instead of saying that, I say, oh, David, I'm really quite concerned. I was looking out my window at 4:00 in the afternoon, and I saw my neighbor open his car door to these school kids who were walking home, and he offered them candy.
And that's the kind of thing that I would tell. Did you hear about this guy who saw his neighbor giving candy? And it's like the picture that's been created.
Yeah. So now what do you think of my neighbor?
I don't trust him.
Yeah. Right.
I'm glad he's not my neighbor.
Actually, we've got the best neighbors in the world. So it's not about them, but just by way of example.
Sure.
So I became a student. And again, I feel like I was so far ahead of the curve, because we're talking again in the early 2000s. Now storytelling is a thing. It wasn't back then. I learned storytelling through the dramatic arts. But then I realized I had to adapt it for business, and I had to adapt it for speakers. A speaker story is, believe me, drives me up a wall when I go to a session on storytelling and for speakers or for people in business, and what I get is the hero's journey.
Right. Yeah.
I said, the hero's journey has 18 steps in it, and it takes 2.5 hours to tell. This is totally inappropriate. So what's happened, but experts in marketing are still peddling this stuff. And so people who hear, oh, storytelling, yeah, I wish I could do it, I'm not good enough or whatever. No, it is the most human thing in the world. We've been telling stories from when we emerged from the savannah, and we had to explain to our fellow brethren of why it's dangerous to meet up with a lion. Because you see my hand? Right? Storytelling from the beginning of time, it's how we've passed on our values, it's how we passed on knowledge. And in fact, anthropologists and neuroscientists hypothesize that our skill and the art of storytelling is one of the things that have allowed us, one of the things that has allowed us, got to get my grammar right, to float to the top of the food chain. And our bodies, like, I'm sorry, you got me on a roll.
Well,
David, you know the thing, give a man a fish, he'll eat for a day, but give a speaker a microphone.
Because what I'm thinking of is most people that are listening to this can probably think of some childhood stories that they heard, right? Just about everyone. Like, what was your favorite story or some of your stories? People could remember those, right? Because they stick. There's something in it that, sometimes there's some morality that's built into it and things like that. So very, very, very powerful. But we have sometimes forgotten how important it is, and to use it every day in our communication with people. And you've obviously discovered that at a deeper level, and are able to use that in your business and in other parts of your life.
Yeah. Storytelling, I believe and in fact, that's what gave rise to Mo Mondays. So if people don't know MoMA, in 2012, I launched a monthly storytelling event that, as people got to know about it, they say, hey, I want to do one in Winnipeg. Hey, I want to do one in Halifax. And so at the height, pre-COVID, we were in 16 cities across the country, in both Canada and the US, and it was licensed out. But what what was the driver behind that for me was, I feel like as a professional speaker, I breathe rarefied air. Like, I get to go to conferences, I get to hear great storytellers, but most people don't. And how do we kind of democratize this beautiful thing called storytelling? Because on a business level, it's how we sell, it's how we communicate our values, it's how we convince investors to invest in our company, it's how we do all these wonderful things. And as speakers, it's how we help our audiences kind of connect with us and tap into their own experience to identify with the point that we're making, that we want them to walk out the door with. So how do we do that and bring it to everybody? I realized that storytelling is a way for us to understand the narrative of our own lives. And most people, they say, oh, I don't need to speak about it, I know my story. But they don't. You don't know your story until you tell it to someone else. Because then it exists in your head with all the filters and assumptions that you've made, but something happens when you speak it out loud. So for the people on stage, it's a very powerful experience.
Well, I know that some of our colleagues, have had these great stories that they've largely kept to themselves and just talked about it in quiet corners. But when they've had the opportunity to do something like to reveal it, to reveal themselves, not just the story, but to the world through a TEDx or something like that, it's just exploded in terms of the connections they've had, the relationships with, because it's not just about the story. You get to know the person in a much more authentic way.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And for the people in the audience, they're seeing you speak about courage. They see courage on stage. It's very powerful for them. So so that's why one of the reasons, or two of the reasons why I believe storytelling is so powerful. But also, storytelling is powerful because it brings people together. It strips away that superficial narrative of us versus them, because at the core of every story is always a very human component, a very human aspect. And so if we could see each other at that very human level, it doesn't matter what religious clothing you're wearing. It doesn't matter what your sexual orientation is. I in fact at Mo Mondays, one of the most powerful stories I've ever heard was about someone who transitioned and became a to trans woman, and and she touched us all with the courage of her story of not feeling just right in her skin for entire life, and how she took the steps to do this and was still on that journey. And I heard this from the people in the audience who otherwise would never have heard or even thought to listen to a story like that. And they said to me, they said to my face, I saw myself
Hmm.
in that story. Because the story is really about being acceptance of self, acceptance of your uniqueness, even if it's shunned.
The other thing that occurs to me, courage, yes, but I think also people really appreciate it when there's true transparency. I know sometimes the word authenticity gets tossed around, but sometimes you hear a story, because I've seen people that tell their stories on stage, and then you meet them after they come off the stage, and it's like, this isn't the person that I heard spoken about on the stage, because there's not that consistency and transparency. And when we don't have to wonder, what's being held back or how much this is fabricated, make it so much easier to be with someone else. And I think it actually changes the atmosphere in the room when you're able to have those kinds of conversations.
Yeah, that's a now you're talking about performance. You're right. There's a lot of I think misunderstanding about what authenticity really is. Some people think it means you have to cry. You don't. It's silly. You have to cry on stage. It's got to be like, no, that's silly. Uh, and some people think it means you should not be rehearsed, or else it won't be authentic, and that's ridiculous. But then you have people who rehearse to the point of it being where you lose that connection to your own story. And so, I mean, because I coach speakers, and there's a way of doing it, and people basically, it's about being present,
Hmm.
present to the story that you're telling, and being no matter how many times you've told it, and that in itself is a skill.
I remember some folks asking, Tim Gard, a colleague of ours, was doing a presentation in Calgary, and someone asked, how do you remember all your stories? How do you retell your stories so well? And Tim said, I don't retell them, I relive them.
Yeah, yeah,
And that was
absolutely.
so powerful, right? To hear him
That's
say that.
that's a real. I knew.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a really good way of saying it, because you're embodying the experience in the moment, and so you're creating that theater in your own mind. You're visualizing in your own mind. Something happens with the audience is that you actually project that image that vision in your mind into the audience. Something, I don't know how it happens, but it does. And yeah, that's a very powerful way of saying it.
So I just want to explore because there's other areas of your life where you embody stories. We were talking about just a little while ago. So maybe you could share a little bit about that.
Well, that remember we talked about this dichotomy between creative and strategic. Well, probably one of the earliest experiences I had about that was literally I'd graduated with science, University of Waterloo.
Me too.
Where?
Something in common.
When?
University of Waterloo.
When?
A while ago, 1977.
That's hilarious.
Earth science.
Yeah. Earth science.
I'm a rock guy.
Yeah. Well, we were on campus at the same time. We were, because your student number starts with 77?
No, 71.
Oh, okay. So you're ahead of
Yeah.
you
In many ways, Michel.
Well, we know that. We know. Yeah, so I graduated from science, and then said, well, do I go into music or do I get my MBA? And of course, the rational side went down. I went to get my MBA at McGill, but music has been a passion of mine. And finally, in the last number of years, I took it up again. And actually, thank you to another colleague of ours, Stephanie Staples, who showed up at my house one day with her ukulele. And I said, I think I'm going to try this. I haven't played in 45 years, but I'm going to try. And it awakened something in me. I cannot begin to tell you what, when my wife said, why are you spending so much time on this? And I said, this is the most important thing in my life right now.
Wow.
And it opened up a well of creativity for me. I started writing songs. I now have an album on Spotify, and just look up my name, Michel Neray, on Spotify or Apple Music or wherever you listen to your, or get, or down, or peer to peer. That's people don't do that anymore, but it's okay. It's just as bad. But yeah, so, and I remember when I first started songwriting, and I'd bring a semi-finished song to my guitar teacher, for example. I said, and he'd look at, and I say, okay, well, this is what I have fleshed out of this song. And he looked at me and he said, that's amazing, Michel. Like, I said, why? That I don't know what I'm doing and I'm doing it anyway? He said, no, that you already know the whole arc of the story in your song. I said, well, yeah. And he said, well, nobody does that I've ever met. And I said, oh. I said, well, maybe it's because I've been a storyteller for 20 years. So I know what has to happen in the first, and a lot of my songs, in fact, are story songs. I know how to progress them. And I didn't know, here's the thing. Sometimes I ask my audiences this, but I'll ask you this, David. Yeah, somebody ever give you a compliment, and I mean, it's a compliment, but your reaction is to shrug your shoulders and say, you've had that experience, right?
Oh, yes. Yep.
Well, what I just described to you is one of those. You say, well, and I said, I don't know what I do, right? I don't know it really is a clue. And I've found this over and over again. And it's not the first time I've said this on a podcast, but I tell people, so if you ever have that experience, notice that that's what you're doing. You're sloughing off what could be a very insightful comment. And the reason why you're doing it is because it's habitual to you. It's natural to you. It's like fabric. It's the fabric of the culture in a company, for example. It's so easy for you. You can't possibly imagine that it would be a challenge for anybody else. And yet that's precisely why you're gifted for it. That's precisely why the person gave you that compliment.
And it just, one of the things that occurred to me, Michelle, is that maybe that's because we already have a story about ourselves that we weren't aware of. And that compliment doesn't fit with our story we have of ourselves unconsciously.
Well, yeah, that's exactly it, David. I totally agree with you because the story that we have of ourselves is usually a very professional story, a very rational story. And this is deeper. This is why we go back to the 5 layers of differentiation. This is deeper and it's more human. It's like, look, you know a little bit about my background. You may not know my mother was a Holocaust survivor, spent a year almost in Auschwitz, did the 3-day death march through the mountains of Poland in January of 1945, put on another cattle train to another concentration camp where they were eventually liberated by the Russians, I believe. And when they found her because they thought she was dead in the street. She hadn't eaten. She was dead. She was too weak to move. And the French had arrived after the camp was liberated. And my mother was born in France, it's a whole other story, but grew up in France. And, she heard, est-ce qu'il y a des Français parmi nous? Are there any French people here? And she managed to lift up her head and say, oui, moi. And, they picked her up. They took her a few months to be literally, gently fed back to health. My father, born in Iran, Jewish, joined the French Foreign Legion, of all things, during the Second World War. Met my mother at a dance for people who were displaced people. They literally met in the elevator. They both punched in floor 10 because that's where the dance was being held, and they got to the top and they hit lobby again. And 3 months later, they got married. So you might say that something else that's in my DNA is a good elevator pitch.
Okay. I promise not to use that again, Michel.
But thank you. They didn't want to give their kids the life that they had. My father facing the anti-Semitism in Iran, my mother, horrific. And they decided to move to Montreal. And then I was a shy little kid, and they had to decide, that's an important piece of information that'll make sense in a minute, but they had to decide what school to send me to. They couldn't afford to send me to the Hebrew school because it was a private school. They weren't rich. They could have sent me to the Catholic school, which was French because I spoke French, or they could send me to the English school that was Protestant, the Protestant English school, which was also because that was the way it was in Montreal at the time. And they decided to send me to the Protestant school, the English Protestant school, which wasn't as weird as it seems because 30 out of the 32 kids in my class were also Jewish.
Oh.
And every morning we would pledge allegiance to the Queen and recite the Lord's Prayer. But that's what we did every day. Didn't feel weird. So
Yep.
Here I was, a little French Jewish kid in an English Protestant school in a French Catholic province. And it didn't matter which group of kids I hung out with. I was always the odd kid out. But I think because I was so hyper aware of the experiences of my parents who struggled throughout their lives just for the sheer being who they were, I had made a decision never to be afraid of who I am.
Hmm.
So I never, to my French friends, I spoke English. To my English friends, I spoke French. And to everyone outside my little community, I never tried to hide the fact that I was Jewish. And it was almost like I wrapped myself in the flag of being different. Like I say, okay, this is who I am. This is who I am. And a remarkable thing happened because I realized that I started to appreciate the differences in everybody around me, what they bring to the party. Each one of us is so unique. We're so wealthy with the diversity that we have. And one of the things I love about living in this city of Toronto is just how diverse it is. You don't realize it until you go to some other city that's not quite so diverse. But being different became a part of who I am. Now, David, 30 years later, my advertising clients, my consulting clients, they say, Michel, how did you put your finger on our unique differentiation so quickly? And you know what I would say for the longest time? Says, oh, I don't know. It's just what I do. Yeah. It's not just what I do. And I think everybody listening to this podcast might have an insight about something they do.
So, Michel, I think that's kind of a great way to wrap this up. That those who've been listening to this, they all have their own stories. They may not know what their stories are, but I think you've kind of talked about the power of finding what those are, like getting down deep to discover those stories, or maybe to have someone else help them to discover it. And I think it makes for a much richer world for all of us. We can have those conversations. So I would like to thank you, Michel Neray, for being here as my guest. And I am David Gouthro, discovering fresh perspectives all the time. And I've certainly discovered some new things that I didn't know about you, Michel, that helps me appreciate you even more. So thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for inviting me.
My pleasure. Subscribe now, because on Fresh Perspectives, every episode is an opportunity to explore new horizons and redefine what's achievable.